let's hurry before it turns off again, and we'll see if we can get through everything. Two major topics today. We're going to talk through a little bit of debugging with PyCharm, which is a very useful feature that it has. Debugging is something we're going to talk about throughout the class. We're going to kind of do it in layers, and those layers are going to kind of correspond to the complexity of the code that you're working on at the time. So right now, the stuff we can do in the debugger is fairly basic because the code we're writing is fairly basic, but it'll still help you with debugging programs and give you some idea of what's available to you. As our code becomes more complex in the class, our debugging abilities will also become more complex, and I'll explain those kind of on an ongoing basis as we go through the class. But today we're going to start talking about debugging and what is the debugger and how to use it. And then I'm going to step you through a sample of how to approach this assignment and sort of set some expectations in terms of like what your assignment should look like, how to use comments within your code, that sort of thing. So all in all, should probably take 30 minutes or less, and then you have plenty of time afterwards to work on stuff. So that's kind of the game plan for today. So starting with the same basic code that we had last time we talked on Monday. Yeah, that's when it was. We've got a basic calculator program that takes three numbers, finds the average. One of those numbers is going to be from an input that'll be assigned to int1. The only other thing that might look a little foreign to you is that I've actually put in a formatting code here. And when I do that with an f string or a string.format function, inside of the curly braces, I put the variable that I'm using at the beginning, which is float average, and that is a float variable, as the name implies. Then I put a colon, and then after that, in the green here, is the formatting code. .2f symbolizes that it's a fixed point number, so it's a decimal number with two decimal places. So if I just put f instead of 0.2f, it'll give me a fixed point number with 6 decimal places because that's the default number of decimal places. So the 0.2 tells me that I'm going to have two places prior to the decimal point, and that's how you work with that formatting feature. The nice thing about the formatting features is that there are all kinds of codes, and I'm going to show you. Oops, that's not the one I wanted. Maybe it was this one. Okay, so if I go to the string.format page on W3 Schools, these are all of the different formatting codes. Notice they all start with a colon, but I can do things like have it insert a comma as a thousand separator, or change things to a scientific format or a binary format, or as we do with this one, a fixed point number. As you can see, there are lots and lots. I can even change to a percentage format. So I can do a whole lot of things with these. And I can also align the result in different ways. And I'm going to show you that next week. I'm going to show you some alignment fun with strings. But those are all of the formatting codes or placeholders that you can use in your code to format strings, in addition to inserting the variable there like we did. So if I run this code right now, it will produce an error. Can anybody tell me what the error is going to be related to? Yes. Yes, it's right here. Int1 takes it as input, and I don't convert it before I try and add it to numbers. So it's basically, even if I enter digits here, when I get to here and it tries to add the string to a number, it's not going to know what to do, and I'll get a type error. So just to demo that, running that, if I insert 10 here, Okay, so I get the type error saying you can't take a string and add it to an int. So what I need to do is I need to do that conversion. But first, let's debug this. So next to the run symbol up here, there's a little bug, a little green bug that allows me to debug this program. When I hit that, I get something that looks very close to a run window. It looks a little bit different, but it is waiting for me to insert an int again. So I will insert the int. And the program runs down to the point where it would encounter the error. Puts a little lightning bolt here saying that's where I found the error. And then it prints out some information here down at the bottom. It tells me what the exception is. Exception is actually a variable. It starts and ends with 2 underscores, which indicates in Python that it's a special variable. But what that allows us to do later is to catch that exception and do something with it. So your program doesn't crash when you have an error, you just handle it. It's called error handling, ironically, or not. And then it tells me the value of the other variables, int1, int2, and int3. It also tells me the type. It says that int1 is a string, int2 is an int, and int3 is an int. And so having that information available to me at that moment in time, so right here, boom, it gets to line 5, error. At that moment in time, this is a snapshot of what those variable values are in my program. So now I can go through and I can actually see what those variables are, because prior to that, I couldn't see unless I printed what the value of the variables are. So now I know I'm getting an error here, and it has to do with the variable types. So I can look at those and I can see, oh, wait, yeah, one's a string still. I forgot to convert that. So if I stop execution and I say int1 equals int, and then int1 inside that, again, using a self-assignment here, it saves me from having to create an extra variable. It just basically says, whatever's in the int1 box, take it out, convert it to an actual int, and then put it back in that box. Works for me. And now I know that the program will run, but just so I can double check some things, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to enter a couple of what are called breakpoints. Okay, so on line 3, I'm going to click right here, just to the right of the 3, on line 5, and on line 7. And those breakpoints are like little markers in my code that will cause the debugger to pause at that moment. It'll stop execution, pause, and give me a report out of what those variables are at each phase. If I run the program, it ignores them. But if I debug, those breakpoints become stopping places. Okay, so you can see it asked me for the int, and then it runs down to line 3 where my first breakpoint is. The breakpoint is before this line of code. So if you look down here, int3 is not yet defined because it hasn't run that line of code yet. What you can see also is during debugging, when I have breakpoints, is that anytime there's an assignment of a variable, it'll tell me what the value of that variable is after executing that code. So even if I have a complex expression like this one, when it gets to the end of that line of code, it will tell me what that line of code is. So I'll throw in another breakpoint just so we can see that. So when I want to go to the next breakpoint, there's a little button right here. It kind of looks like the skip track button on a music player. It'll get me to the next breakpoint, where now I have defined int1, int2, and int3. At this point in time, right here, before it executes this line of code, int1, still a string, equal to the digits 1, 0. So I'll go to the next breakpoint. Now I can see int1 is a string, is an int, sorry. Go to the next one. tells me the sum. So I have an assignment here. It tells me what it is. Even though it's adding those three variables together, I can see that's what it equals right now. And then the next line is about to be executed, float average. And that is the last breakpoint. So the program will carry through all the way to the end now. And if I go over to console, I can see, prints out the average is 11, which is correct because I have 10, 11, 12. So any three numbers in sequence, the middle number is always the average. So everything is working properly. One more thing that's kind of interesting that you can do, I'm going to run the debugger one more time and insert the int. One interesting thing that you can do is just on the right-hand side of the debugger top bar, there's a button that says Evaluate Expression. It gives me the ability to, at this point in time, at this point running the program, given these values of these variables, I can try out an expression. So if I said int1 plus int2, I can evaluate that. I get a type error. I can test it to see if it'll work if I do that. And I get a result of 21. So I can try out different calculations or any expression in this code in this code window here, and it'll give me the result of that here, given the values of those variables at that point in time. So there's lots of testing that you can do all the way through your program to actually figure out where those codes are. Debugging is super important because a bad programmer could spend 80% of their time debugging their own code and 20% of the time writing it. So if you, and you'll figure that out in this class as you start to write code. The first time you write code, you're like, yeah, I got through that pretty fast. And then you spend the next 3 hours debugging it. So if you get better at debugging, you actually can spend more time writing code, which gets you more done, which allows you to accomplish more as a programmer. So debugging is an important skill. And that is the debugger. Any questions about the debugger before I move on to the next piece? Okay, cool. We will use the debugger a lot, and we'll talk about some of the more advanced features when we have some more advanced code to run it on. Now, for this program, for the calculator example, I am going to use the formula for the volume of a right rectangular pyramid. Basically, it's any four-sided pyramid that has right angles and a rectangular shape at the bottom of it. So given those constraints, this formula will give you the volume of that pyramid. It is the length of a side times the width of a side times the height of the pyramid, all that divided by 3. So it's a pretty simple formula, but good for this. So for this assignment 3, we are making a simple calculator program. Okay, you are welcome to use any formula you want, as long as it's not the one I'm showing you right now, because I already have the code on the website. But here are some things that I want you to consider as you start to develop. We're getting into more like developing real programs. So I want you to start thinking about these things and using these practices. Number one is I want you to use comments to tell me what it is you're doing. The comments are good for you because it's good practice to get into. If you ever write code in any scenario where anybody else is ever going to be reading your code, having comments there helps them understand what it is you're doing. It also helps you because eventually you're going to write some longer programs. And it's very common to get to the end of a longer program and then you scroll back up in the debugging process and you're like, what was I doing there? Having comments helps you remember. Third reason to have comments in your code for this class is if you can't get your code to work right, or you upload it and something's not right with it, I can at least see what it was that you were intending to do. And then that helps me close that gap in your knowledge as far as what you've learned in the class. So each line of code, or each group of code, if it makes sense, I want you to use comments to tell me what it is you're doing. So the first thing I'm going to do on my program, because you can't just have a program that says, tell me the height. The height of what? The width of what? So I'm going to welcome the user. I'm going to tell them, set the context for them. This is basic usability. I'm going to say something like, let's calculate the volume of a pyramid. And I should say a right rectangular pyramid. But something like that would be fine. And then I'm going to gather the input variables. So in a group like this where there's a lot of repetition, and I'm gathering 3 variables kind of using the same methods, I don't really have to like comment each line, gather 1 input variable, I could just say gather input variables because we're all pretty smart people here. We can figure it out. So remember the 3 levels of usability I talked about? The first one being ask the right question or ask for the right input. The second one being filter the input to make sure it's valid, and the third being catch the errors in case all that fails. So we're still at level 1 of usability here, but I'm trying to guide them by telling them what it is I want and what format I want it in. So I'm trying to be as specific as possible here. So I got length as an integer, and now some of you may be catching me in my own rule set here, violating my own rules. It's not actually an integer yet, is it? But it will be very soon. In fact, right after this, I'm going to do the conversions. And so it's easier in some ways to have fewer variables. If I was being really strict about this, I'd probably go str length, and then when I convert it to an integer, I'd create a new variable called int length. That's sort of a minor infraction. And just sort of like when you're driving a car, sometimes it makes sense to break the rules a little bit. Like you can leave your lane if somebody's about to hit you, or you go really fast if it's a safety issue. Like if you're crossing a train track and there's a train coming, maybe you speed up a little bit. So there are times when you have minor infractions, as long as you can keep track of what you're doing. So I've got 1 for width and 1 for height. Those are the 3 variables that I will need to determine. And I'm being very specific with the user about what I want. Another thing that I like to do for usability's sake is leave a space. This is just totally a personal thing, but when I'm asking for input, I like to leave a colon and a space at the end of the line. Visually, it just looks a little bit nicer when they're putting the input in. Just my opinion, of course. And now, of course, I'm going to go right into the conversion. Oops, that's not what I wanted to say. We could just fix this and type it ourselves. Int length equals int. Now I could have done this. I could have done this conversion right here by wrapping this input statement in an int, but here's the problem with that. Later on, when I have the ability to test that input before I try to convert it, because if I try and convert it and it's not an int, it's going to give me an error. Right now, I don't have the ability to do anything about that, but later on, I will be able to check that input to make sure it's valid, and I'll need a space to do it. So I would do that here because I can't do it. It doesn't give me space. It just tries to convert it right as soon as I hit enter with no intervening code. So this method or this structure allows me some space. Okay, so int height width. There we go. Okay, so now I've got them all converted to int. Now I can do some math. Do the calculation. Now, and again, I could do this conversion on the fly as I'm calculating them, right? By surrounding each variable with int down here in the formula. The reason I don't like to do that is that it makes the formula look kind of clunky and complicated. And I think when you're doing a formula, it's nice to keep it really clean and as simple as possible, just visually, so you can easily keep track of what's going on. So I know that I'm going to do division here, so I'm going to end up with a float. So I'll start there. Float volume equals int width times int length times int height, all that divided by 3. So that is a valid formula. That will work. It will work the way it's supposed to because none of these are addition. It's all multiplication division. It'll just go left to right. It'll work just fine. However, I will say this. In my coding, in a situation like this, because I have a visual of the formula being this here, length times width times height over 3, so that length, width, and height are kind of grouped together, all divided by 3. Even though it will still work the same way mathematically, I like to group these together like this just for my brain, because now I can really easily envision all of those things over 3. And then I have a visual of what that formula looks like in my mind, even though mathematically it makes zero difference for me to do that. So last thing is I'm going to tell the user the answer. Okay, print out the answer. And so I'm going to go print, and I'm going to use an F string here. The volume of this pyramid is float volume, and I'll use the 2 decimal places. Now let's use 1. Okay, so there we go. So let's run this and see what happens. Insert an int. Oops, I'm like, that doesn't sound right. All right, so we're going to run this script. Okay, so there we go. Let's calculate the volume of a pyramid, enter the length of the base as an integer. I'm going to go real simple here. This is a very bizarre looking pyramid, but 1 by 1 by 6, if I plug those into the formula, provides me with a nice clean answer, because 1 times 1 times 6 is 6, divided by 3 is 2, which would be the volume of this pyramid. If I have my calculations right, looks good so far. So that is the whole assignment. I just did assignment 3 right in front of you. This is what I would be looking for assignment 3 output. If you really wanted to make it nice for the user, you might have it print some blank lines in there, give it some white space. You might also report back what they input. You would say, you're saying you're calculating a pyramid with a 1 by 1 base and a height of 6. The volume of that pyramid is 2. Okay, so those are some other things that you might consider doing as you work on this assignment. You can use any formula that you want. This is just a basic calculation. I do want some usability considerations built in. I'll be looking for that. And also, we're going to start commenting our lines of code so that I understand what it is you're doing. Now that we're way beyond hello world and very quickly getting into more complex structures, it becomes increasingly important for me to be able to see what it is you were working on or what it is you were trying to accomplish with your code so that I can help you make sure you learn what you're supposed to learn. So that's it. This pyramid code is already on the website, as is the code that I was using for debugging. If you want to mess around with that in the debugger, obviously the debugger will work with any code, but both of those pieces of code are up there. I'll get the video up as soon as possible, and that's that. Any questions? Okay, so you have approximately, what time is this class end? 2:30? Yeah, so you've got, yeah, so you've got a while. You got almost an hour to work on this if you want to. So